Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise and I should say too that I take the liberty to say that Senator Moore and Senator Boyce will also be talking about this particular topic, because we are talking about the Community Affairs Reference Committee inquiry into involuntary or coerced sterilisation of intersex people in Australia. This is a committee report that, in fact, we tabled last year, but it was during that period when the Senate wasn't sitting, and we didn't get an opportunity to talk about the report in the chamber, and we wanted to have an opportunity to talk about it because, as I know that representatives of organisation Intersex International Australia, and they are members of the organisation actually in the gallery, and I would like to acknowledge both Morgan and Tony, who both gave evidence to the inquiry, but who have given the senators and the committee a very strong signal that they very much like the report and have expressed their appreciation to us about the report, and in fact noted what a significant milestone the report is. We wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the report, and as the 7th of April is World Health Day, we thought this was appropriate time to be talking about the report. What the Senate referred to the committee to look into, as I said, was it was the involuntary or coerced sterilisation of intersex people in Australia, but it was also the second part of our inquiry into involuntary and coerced sterilisation of people with disability. This was the second reference the chamber made to us, and they asked us to remind the chamber, because it was a while ago, to inquire into the current practices and policies relating to the involuntary or coerced sterilisation of intersex people, including sexual health and reproductive issues and the impact on intersex people. And the more we looked into this, in fact, we took much longer to do this inquiry than I think originally that we anticipated, because there are some very significant issues that we have identified and heard evidence about, and we have made a series of 15 recommendations that I think, hopefully I speak for all of us on the Community Affairs Committee, we will be pursuing implementation of those recommendations the same way that we pursue implementation of the recommendations that we make on many of our inquiries. I think I would like to quote, in fact it was from the OII submission about the experiences of Michael Noble, and for me it captures some of the issues that we've been talking about and the way that society forces on people and parents decisions that have extremely long-term implications. And Michael Noble's quoted his experience, and this is available on our website for people that want to actually read the OII submission, because it has some very important information in it. He said, around the age of 23, an endocrinologist discovered that my body had never produced enough testosterone for me to undergo a full puberty. He therefore suggested I commence testosterone therapy. Initially, I resisted the pressure placed on me to commence therapy, yet eventually I crumbled under the constant onslaughts of threats and horror stories of what my future would be like if I didn't undergo therapy, which the doctors' claims would turn me into a real man. It was insinuated, even blatantly stated on occasions, that my life would be worthless, that I would be a freak, that I would never achieve my potential, and that I would never have any self-esteem. Apparently the self-esteem I already had was invalid, as it existed outside the predefined paradigm of being a real man. So eventually, from the age of 28, after about 6 years of constant threats and counselling by my medical specialist, I began testosterone therapy, and I found it to be a horrifying experience. Testosterone therapy generated profound and traumatic changes in me. I lost contact with who I was and thus my sense of self. I was mortified when I began to grow large amounts of hair where hair had never been. My voice dropped. I developed a very strong libido that found the feelings unwelcome. I lost contact with my heart and the ability to relate to people in a non-sexual manner. I just couldn't function as, inverted commas, a normal male, and this caused me significant psychological and physical distress. Worst of all, however, was that the therapy turned me into somebody I was not. And hearing experiences and accounts through the inquiry, such as Michael's, really did profoundly affect and provide very profound insights into the effects that people outside medical professionals, society, pressuring intersex people, it really was important that we had those experiences related to us so that we could get an understanding of just what the lives of people that have been had decisions forced on them is like. As I said, we made 15 recommendations, but of course, first off, we needed to we outlined and defined what intersex is, and I think most people in the community actually don't understand intersex and don't understand the issues. And it was really, and it's people in the past have seen it as a disorder. In fact, I think it's fair to say still do. And so one of our recommendations is that that's in fact not the word, the terminology that should be used. So we strongly recommend that the government and other organisations use the term intersex and do not use the term disorders of sexual development, because intersex people should not be seen to have a disorder. Also, we also point out that there is no one condition that is intersex. There's in fact 30 or 40 testable genetic, anatomical and hormonal types of sex difference, and that also we need to make sure that that's clear. But most importantly, we need to understand that this is a human rights issue, and our recommendation, and the committee recommends, that all medical treatment of intersex people take place under guidelines that ensure treatment is managed by multidisciplinary teams within a human rights framework, and that guidelines should favour deferment of normalising treatment until the person can give fully informed consent, and seek to minimise surgical interventions on infants undertaken for primarily psychosocial reasons. And I know that, because I've spoken to both Tony and Morgan, that this is considered one of our key recommendations, because it is essential that, in fact, and it's very consistent with the recommendations we made in our first part of our report, which is into forced and coerced involuntary and coerced sterilisation of people with disability. People will see a very similar theme that we've taken through there, and that is, shouldn't be making decisions for young people. They have a right to make their own decisions. In fact, people have a right to make their decisions, and there should be minimalise any intervention on infants, because society is forcing parents into making a decision now, which of course takes the decision out of that person into the future. And that we also make the point that the government should be funding multidisciplinary teams. One of the issues that came up is lack of integrated support and the multidisciplinary approach, and that funding should be provided for establishing intersex medical care that has dedicated, coordinated record-keeping and research support capacity and comprehensive membership from various medical and non-medical specialists. All intersex people should have access to a multidisciplinary team, and that came across time and time and again in the recommendations. I know my colleagues will pick up other elements of this report. I would, as is tradition, like to take the opportunity to thank the Secretariat, who put so much effort into this report, and detailed research, because we did a lot of research for this report. Usually I don't always pick out give special mention, but I would like to specially mention Ian Holland, who did a superb job with this committee. He really went the extra mile to do the research, because there is so little information. We had to seek some of the information overseas. So I recommend that everybody have a read of this report. it really does start to address the issues that we need to be addressing.
Thank you, Senator Seward. Senator Boyce.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy President. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join my colleagues from the Community Affairs Committee, Senators Moore and Seward, in speaking to this report tonight. I'm also delighted that we have in the gallery Morgan Carpenter, the President of the organisation Intersex International Australia, OII, and Tony Briffa, who is the Vice President of OII and of the Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome Support Group, which sounds like a big mouthful, but perhaps illustrates in some ways the medical model that has in the past been the way that intersex and intersex people have been seen in our community. As Senator Seward said, this inquiry grew out of an earlier inquiry we had started into the topic of involuntary and coerced sterilisation of people with disabilities. And it was initially thought that we could handle the inquiry into the sterilisation of intersex people within the same inquiry. Some of the issues are the same. I certainly know that within the disability community there is a slogan that says, "Nothing about us without us." It certainly is something that the intersex community would like to see applied to them as well. The issues that were similar were issues where some in the medical profession thought they knew better than anyone else and would make decisions not only on behalf of individuals but on behalf of families as to what gender might be assigned to a baby or to a young child when this was not immediately obvious. The other area that was similar, in fact, to the question of sterilisation of women with disabilities was the fact that parents' wishes would often be seen as superior and more important than the wishes of the individual themselves. What differed was the fact that people with disabilities that we were talking about in many cases were not seen as being able to give informed consent because of cognitive impairment. In the case of intersex people, the main issue was that this was being done before they were too young to give consent, and that the intersex community itself believed that this was drastic changes needed to happen in this area. So we moved on to conduct a second inquiry, and I'd like to support Senator Seward's comments about the former Secretary of the committee, Dr Ian Holland, who did a superb job, well beyond that might be considered reasonable, to make sure that both of these inquiries came up with were based on very, very sound grounds and were very cogent. As Senator Seward explained, intersex is a continuum of conditions, initially some not diagnosed even until perhaps puberty, but in the main diagnosed in babies or early in life, that lead to a different development of gender. It has been the practice in the past for doctors to make a decision, and often it would appear based on fashion or what was easiest. There was a great spurt of intersex babies being turned into girls in the 60s. In the 70s, they were more likely to be treated as boys. And Tony, I know, won't mind if I mention his story, which was that he was one of twins. He had a twin sister. His condition was incomplete testicular feminisation, which is now known as partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Doctors decided that even though he was genetically male, he'd be better off being assigned as a female, and told his parents to call him Antoinette and leave it at that. I don't know how anyone here can begin to imagine what a life lived as perhaps someone that you aren't must be like. It's just very difficult to imagine. But it is a situation that affects at least 5,000 Australians currently and could affect many more that we perhaps are unaware of, because there is still a taboo in many areas of talking about intersex people and the issues that they experience. The amount of medicalisation of the condition, the fact that children are often left in the situation where they are spending a lot of their time visiting specialists, being treated as something of a freak or a sideshow, having medical interventions, commonly experiencing operation after operation, is a terrible situation. We're very proud within the committee that this report is apparently the first in the world into the sterilisation of intersex people. Morgan had the opportunity recently to present to a side event at the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva just a couple of weeks ago in regard to our report, which is, I'm pleased to say at least, garnering international interest, even if we haven't managed to speak perhaps as broadly as we should on the topic here. As Senator Siewert said, I think that probably the most important of our recommendations, of which I think there were 14, I beg your pardon, 15, the committee recommended that all proposed intersex medical interventions for children and adults without the capacity to consent shouldn't happen without authorisation from a civil and administrative tribunal or the family court. We recommended that certainly nothing should happen to a child with intersex attributes until they were old enough to be involved in making a decision themselves. We recommended that all medical treatment should take place under guidelines that ensure the treatment was managed by multidisciplinary teams within a human rights network, and that we should favour deferral of what is considered normalising treatment until the person could give fully informed consent, and that we should seek to minimise surgical intervention on infants, particularly if it is primarily undertaken for psychosocial reasons. The discomfort that we all experience, and I think some more than others, around sexuality in general, I think came up during both of the inquiries that we held. In terms of women with disability, there seemed to be a very strange attitude from many, many quarters towards menstruation and women with a disability. In the area of intersex, it seemed to the issues were more around people trying to deal with genitalia that they considered to be outside the norm, and doctors feeling that they were in the position to be the ones that ought to make the decision. I'm very pleased to say that my home state and that of Senator Moore's, Queensland, has in the past 12 months come up with some very important changes to their education policy for intersex people. We have the case of some very forward-thinking parents and their 9-year-old daughter Emma, who refused to. Emma's parents supported her in refusing to use the disabled toilet at school because she was not disabled. Emma had decided at 5 that she wanted to identify as a girl, despite the fact that she had been born Ronan and was now 9. So their threat of a legal suit against the Queensland government forced the government into a policy which says school staff will be provided with practical information to support the respectful treatment and inclusion of all students, including same-sex attracted, transgender or intersex students. And this was it wasn't appropriate, it was decided to direct students to disabled toilets as an alternative. It is great to see a school system, at least, providing this sort of respect and understanding of intersex people. I encourage that
Senator
everywhere.
Boyce. Senator Moore.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. At the beginning of any inquiry, we actually put down why we started an inquiry, and we say thank you to people who helped us. Certainly we've heard from both Senator Siewert and Senator Boyce about the history of this inquiry taking place. But in saying who we wanted to thank, we also should acknowledge one of the major reasons this inquiry happened was for the Organisation of Intersex International, OII. And in terms of the process, thank you. Thank you so much for actually sharing with us and giving us the knowledge and the strength to actually walk with you through this inquiry, because it wouldn't have happened without you, and we would not have learnt so much that I think all of us together in this inquiry did. We actually had our own views at the beginning of the experience, but we learnt so much about the history of the isolation, the labelling and the lack of identity given to people who are intersex. In terms of the process, we had difficulty finding definitions. We always do with the research. But the one that I liked, the one that I like to quote, is one that says that intersex is not a medical condition or a disorder or a disability or a pathology or a condition of any sort. Intersex is differences in the same way height, weight, hair colour and so on are differences. Then, of course, that is way too simple, but in terms of actually putting down a definition, it is not a condition, it's not a disability. Intersex relates to people. Councillor Tony, I was putting this together. Funnily, your quotes kept jumping out at me, and I want to start with the one that I think summed up the feeling we had when we worked together in this inquiry. And during the evidence, Councillor Tony Buffer said, and I quote, "I feel, and the support group feels, that this is an amazing time for intersex. We see the human rights and anti-discrimination legislation referencing intersex at this moment, which is brilliant, as well as an acknowledgement that we exist and that it is a biological variation which has all been wonderful. My birth certificate from the state of Victoria does not classify me as male or female. I have certainly had a female birth certificate, I had a male birth certificate at one stage, and I have a blank birth certificate now. But we are hoping that one day in the future our birth certificates will actually be able to reflect, for those who want it, the way nature made us. If people feel female, that's great, and if they feel male, that's great. But there are also people like me. I just accept the way nature made me. I'm happy for my birth certificate to say I'm both male and female. One day, hopefully, we'll have that as well." In terms of a statement, that was actually the joy that we felt in learning that people, through their hard work and commitment and professional skills, have been able to change the way our community looks at intersex. Because we've seen that in the past it has been cruel and labelling, and the worst possible form that we ever heard was this focus completely on the term normalisation. And we heard that consistently both in this inquiry and the one before us on people with disability. What we need to know is to take away the fear and take away the uncertainty and ensure that we listen to people who have their understanding about what they need. And that's not come easily, because certainly in our own situation we've heard consistently about the issues of medicalisation. And when we are looking at the history of intersex, we consistently see that it's been defined in a medical way. And as Senator Boyce has put it, the medical focus has meant that people are ignored to a large extent and are looked upon as caseload, as things that have to have treatment rather than people with feelings and human rights. And I think what came out, and consistently in our recommendations we have said, that the issues around intersex in our country should be seen as human rights issues, so that people have support, recognition and respect. There was a considerable amount of research done, and again I want to echo the comments made about the work that Dr Ian Holland did in this inquiry. I think what happened for all of us is that once we started listening to the evidence, we became completely engaged in both the history of what had gone on before and in the current situation and the need for engagement and the need for understanding. In this process, we also learned very much about the need for engagement of peer groups and support groups, because apart from everything else that went on, there was actually a need that people needed personal support themselves and their families and their friends, so that the role of peer groups became particularly important. Another quote from Councillor Briffa referred to a situation where, in a medical process, when a young person was identified as having intersex process, in terms of what happened, there was a discussion about a young child who was born who had both intersex issues and also a cleft palate. The parents in that family were given significant support and interaction about issues around cleft palates, but were left completely ignorant of the sensitivities and the importance of issues around intersex. I thought that that example exemplified to a great extent the failures in our current system. We talked, and we often talk in our inquiries, about the importance of multidisciplinary teams, and one of our recommendations was looking at the need for expertise in the field of intersex. One of the sadnesses is, of course, there is way too few practitioners who have the range of skills and knowledge that are needed to work with people and families through the processes of working out what would be the best outcome for the young person, often identified at birth or in early childhood, but for them and their families. And Senator Boyce, I love the story of the young woman in Queensland, because that exemplified the process of a family working together with a young person who actually made their own decision with the full support of their family at an early age about who they are, and then made sure that the rest of the society accepted that and worked with them. And it actually is part of that hope that we heard about from Councillor Briffa, that we now have a situation where a state government, which is not always known to be flexible in terms of process of interacting with individuals, has been able to work with that young woman and ensure that she is able to make her own choices and move through with that total feeling of support. We have a way to go, and certainly there are a number of recommendations there about the need for professional skills and development, and we were impressed by the work of people at the Royal Hospital in Melbourne, who seem to have the most highly defined knowledge around this area and worked effectively, and most importantly worked with people from OII to ensure that there was this range of knowledge. We always get focused on documentation in this committee, and again the information about people being able to have documentation that reflects their own identity rather than being forced into something that is not them. And that is something I think the sex discrimination legislation that we had passed in 2013 has clearly identified now the issues around human rights and respect for people who identify as intersex for the first time. And again, I think for our nation we can be proud of that. I hope that this report is read by people, not just the international groups that may find it interesting by looking through on the Google aspects, but because of the amount of work that's been done here to look at the history and to look at the achievements and to look at where we need to go next. I would hope that this report will provide an opening that people who have this interest would be able to learn more and find how they can learn even more. The OII was very focused on family counselling rather than surgical options, and I think that that summed up a lot of the discussion we had around the medical process. And they had guidelines for how they think that should happen, and I think they sum up again a lot of the issues that we talked about. Medical intervention should not assume crisis in our difference nor normalisation as a goal. Medical, in particular surgical interventions, must have a clear ethical basis supported by evidence of long-term benefit. We must have data that's effective and recorded on intersex births, and we should most see that necessary medical intervention on minors should preserve the potential for different life paths and identities until the patient is old enough to consent. We need to know that medical intervention must not pathologise intersex through the use of stigmatising language. Again, Mr Acting Deputy President, the issue of stigma came up consistently, and it flows on from ignorance and fear. People should not be stigmatised because of who they are. In fact, the clear message from our report is that people should be valued and respected, and that they know who they are, and they should be able to share that openly with all of us. Again, I particularly want to thank so many people who gave their lives to us for the purpose of this report. We have a responsibility, as I say many times in this parliament, to respond to the recommendations and make sure that this is a worthwhile exercise.
Thank you, Senator Moore. Senator